The cicadas are screaming tonight in a way that sounds like tearing silk, a frantic, rhythmic buzzing that settles deep in the damp floorboards of this old house. Welcome, sugar, to the Absurd Truths and Blatant Lies podcast. I am your host, Mrs. Beaumont, sitting here amidst the scent of overripe jasmine and the slow decay of things that refuse to stay buried. It is a rare treat to have my common-law husband sitting across the settee from me this evening. It truly was the sweetest thing for him to tear himself away from the company of that pretty homosexual lover of his just to join us in the shadows. He's still got the dust of the road on his boots, but we have work to do, and the dead don't wait for a man to finish his dalliances. Tonight, we are peeling back the heavy velvet curtains of the past to look at the grotesque mask of the minstrel show, exploring how those garish caricatures were used to stifle and shroud the immense, aching brilliance of black entertainers and musicians who deserved a stage of gold rather than a coat of burnt cork. We shall turn the needle on a certain award-winning tune, a melody that rings sweet as honeysuckle but tastes like copper and shame, and examine the tangled, problematic roots it has struck in our red clay.
From there, we'll find a bit of grace in the quiet gray coats of the Quakers, tracing how their steady hands helped stitch the wounds of a broken land and ushered in the halting steps of a new South. But don't get too comfortable in the light, for we must finally speak of the daughters of the Confederacy, those genteel weavers of myth who spent decades spinning cobwebs into history books, turning a bitter defeat into a holy shroud of moonlight and magnolias. Pull up a chair and pour yourself something stiff. The truth is often a jagged pill, and I wouldn't want you to choke on it.
Come close to the fire, children, and listen to the scratching of the needle against the wax, for therein lies a ghost story of the highest order, a tale of a man named George W. Johnson who sang the laughing song into the very teeth of history. He stands as the first black recording artist, a pioneer who etched his voice onto fragile cylinders of beeswax and soap in the early 1890s, long before the world knew what a star truly was. Unlike the many souls who paraded in the borrowed finery of white minstrel composers, Johnson was the architect of his own melody, a creator who seized the pen to reclaim a style that had been weaponized to mock his own kin. It was a minstrel tune, yes, and a precursor to the ragtime rhythms that would soon shake the floorboards of the nation, but it was also a defiance, a sound born in Virginia and forced through the narrow acoustic horn of a machine that cared nothing for his humanity, only his pitch. We must understand the setting, not as a place of comfort, but as a battleground of acoustics, where the surface noise of those early cylinders hissed like a nest of vipers. Johnson's voice had to be a blade, sharp enough to cut through the static, and so he developed a whistling and laughing technique of such distinct resonance that it became a marvel of the age. It is true that the song reinforced the happy servant trope, that comfortable lie the 19th century told itself to sleep at night, yet Johnson subverted this caricature through a sheer, undeniable technical mastery. His laughter was so precise, so musically perfect, that it became a standard of professional excellence that white performers, try as they might with their cork and greasepaint, found themselves unable to emulate. The mask, it seemed, fit only the master who carved it. For the black Southerners of his time, Johnson's ascent was a double-edged sword, a triumph wrapped in a tragedy. He proved with every cylinder sold that a black voice could be a monumental commercial success, a titan in the marketplace, but the toll was the performance of a stereotype that denied his complexity. The Laughing Song stands now as a monument of complex history, its literary merit rested not in the prose, which is simple, but in its weight as a text of survival. It represents that singular, electric moment when Southern black identity first collided with the machine of mass media, forcing us to reckon with the grotesque performance required of black Virginians in a world that had supposedly broken its chains but kept its cages. Time, like the river, changes the shape of the land, and the modern perception of Johnson's work has shifted from viewing it as a mere historical curio to revering it as a profound text of subversion and survival. We treat this recording now with a mixture of academic reverence and a deep cultural mourning, stripping away the embarrassment to find the genius beneath. Historians like Tim Brooks in his seminal work Lost Sounds have led the charge to rescue Johnson from the shadows of the minstrel era, asking us to look past the lyrics to the man's stamina. We celebrate him now as the first star, a man who, lacking the luxury of mass duplication, was forced to sing that same song upwards of 50,000 times, lung by lung, take by take, a labor of Hercules performed in a suit of sound. There has been a righteous validation from the high temples of memory, for in 2013, the Library of Congress inducted the Laughing Song into the National Recording Registry, cementing its status as a work of aesthetic and historical significance. Contemporary theorists like Anya Casadei now listen to that laughter and hear not joy, but haunted sound, a noise that becomes eerie when one remembers Johnson was born the property of another man. It is viewed as a necropolitical refusal, a way in which Johnson filled the record with convulsive, non-verbal sound to erase the lyrical self the industry sought to categorize. He gave them the noise they craved, while withholding the true narrative of his lived experience, keeping his soul tucked away where the needle could not scratch it. In this New South, we view the song as a sonic cousin to Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, We Wear the Mask, a perfect example of strategic essentialism, where a man leans into the wind of a stereotype to find his footing. While old critics dismissed it as sonic blackface, we now look with empathy, recognizing that for a black man in the 1990s, this caricature was the only entry fee accepted at the gate of the music industry. The history of black artists in minstrelsy is the great paradox of our culture, a deal with the devil where performers donned the very masks designed to dehumanize them, yet in doing so they survived and fundamentally shaped the DNA of American theater, comedy, and song. The minstrel stage, grotesque as it was with its burnt cork and exaggerated grins, was often the only stage available, a Trojan horse used by black performers to smuggle authentic Southern culture into the drawing rooms of the mainstream. W.E.B. Du Bois spoke of this double consciousness, and these performers lived it, performing the happy-go-lucky fool while remaining highly trained musicians and shrewd businessmen beneath the paint. It was troupes like the Georgia minstrels who professionalized the art, turning rural traditions into a polished industry and serving as the primary vehicle for spreading ragtime and early blues. Without these traveling tents, the transition from the field hollers of the plantation to the sophisticated syncopation of the jazz age would have been lost to the silence of the cotton fields. We must acknowledge the logistics of this survival, the creation of the Chitlin Circuit, which was born from the necessity of knowing which towns would not kill you and which theaters would pay you. And consider the cakewalk, perhaps, the greatest act of cultural subversion ever staged. Black performers brought this dance to the minstrel show, and white audiences roared with delight, entirely unaware that the high-stepping movements were a parody of their own aristocratic grand marches. It was the first black dance craze to sweep the nation, a joke told in motion that the butt of the joke never understood. We view these artists now not as sellouts, but as cultural architects who built the financial infrastructure that allowed later giants like Duke Ellington and Langston Hughes to finally discard the mask. The lineage continues, unbroken, as current black Southern artists engage with Johnson's legacy through reclamation and subversion, using the old tools to dismantle the new master's house. Childish Glover, though born of the West, roots his visual language in the Georgia experience. In This Is America, his facial contortions and jarring shifts from joy to violence are the direct descendants of Johnson's uncontrollable laughter, a critique of the trap where black men are loved for their entertainment and hunted for their existence. His physical posturing mimics the Jim Crow minstrel poses, arguing that the viral fame of today is simply the old minstrel stage reborn in digital light. Rhiannon Giddens of North Carolina, a successor, who approaches music with the rigor of a historian and the soul of a Gothic writer. She has reclaimed the banjo, reminding the world that it is an instrument of African origin, stripping away the buffoonery of the minstrel era to reveal the technical mastery and the sorrow beneath. She performs the songs of the circuit, but restores the missing narratives, proving that black Southerners were the architects of the American sound, even when they were forced to wear a disguise to be heard. Adia Victoria, a daughter of South Carolina, spins this thread into a darker tapestry, her Southern Gothic style reflecting the haunted side of the laughter Johnson recorded. She explores the laughter to keep from crying motif, her vocals sultry and gritty, exposing the anxieties and trauma that Johnson was forced to hide behind a major key. She rejects the moonlight and magnolias myth, replacing the minstrel's accommodating grin with a gaze that demands to be seen as fully, terrifyingly human. Similarly, Jake Blount subverts the novelty label by taking the spirituals and performing them with an Afro-futurist intensity, proving these were never just funny little tunes, but coded messages of resistance passed through the fire. For the white South, reconciling with this legacy requires a journey from myth-making to truth-telling, a refusal to look away from the skeletons in the garden. We must acknowledge that what we call traditional music, bluegrass, country, folk, was built on the backs of artists like George W. Johnson, and we must honor the banjo's roots in Africa and the pioneers like Billy Cursons and Master Juba. We must recognize that many of our cherished traditions began as black parodies of white culture, and we must learn to call out the caricature, distinguishing between the authentic human expression and the mask worn for survival.
To honor this history is to embrace the tension, to accept that the Southern drawl and the laughing song contain both a terrible history of silence and a resilient, undeniable beauty. We must value survival over stereotype, viewing Johnson not as a victim who gave in, but as a Virginian genius who used the only tools he had to lay the foundation of an industry. We must support the museums and the string bands that tell the truth, for to be a Southerner is to understand that our story was written by two hands on one pen, pulling in different directions, yet creating a single, complicated, and hallowed text.
We shall let the ghost of the minstrel's banjo fade into the cypress knees for now, though do not think for a moment that those painted smiles have finished their haunting. We'll be returning to that dark, grease-painted theater in a later episode to see what else lurks behind the footlights. But for this evening, As the moon hangs heavy and yellow like a bruised fruit, we must turn our gaze toward a different kind of artifice. Being that it is Black History Month, we have spent these long, humid weeks sifting through the hymns and the blues of the South, honoring the black artists whose voices are the very marrow in this country's bones. Yet we stumbled upon a curious, thorny thing, a chipper little tune from the vaults of Disney that skips along with a gaiety that feels almost predatory. There was a fair amount of pacing on the porch and hushed, sharp debate in the kitchen before we decided to bring this particular melody into the light. It is a song that wears a bright, sunny mask, humming with a rhythmic joy that belies the shadows cast by the film it calls home. We grappled with whether to give it airtime at all, wondering if some stones are better left unturned in the muck. But silence is a luxury we can no longer afford. So we shall hold this upbeat bit of celluloid history up to the lamp, looking past its animated whimsy to see the complicated, aching heart of the man who gave it a voice, and the heavy price of a song that sounds like a celebration but feels like a cage. Do pull up a wicker chair and sit a spell, though you must mind the rot in the floorboards. This house, much like our history, has a way of giving way just when you think you've found your footing. We are here to speak of a ghost that refuses to stay in the attic, a melody that is the final boss of our southern contradictions. You know the tune, the one that skips along with a bluebird on its shoulder. Yet it is tethered to a film Disney has seen fit to bury in a vault deep beneath the earth, as if a layer of soil could ever truly silence a heartbeat. It is a song of bright colors and wide smiles, but for those of us who study the bones of our literature, it is a haunting, a gilded cage built from the satisfactual lies we tell ourselves to keep from screaming at the moon.
There is a story that is told, and there is a story that is stolen. Long before the ink was dry on a Disney contract, there was the rabbit, the trickster who lived in the briar patch of the mind. He was a creature of the great Smoky Mountains and the red clay of the South, a hero of the Cherokee and the stolen sons of Africa alike. But then came Joel Chandler Harris, a white man with a sharp pen who gathered these tales of resistance and survival and smoothed their edges until they were soft enough for a nursery. He took the Brer Rabbit who fought to stay alive and turned him into a whimpering fable told by a subservient old man. We must look at this song to see how the tools of our ancestors' survival were translated into a language of comfort for those who never felt the lash, a sanitation of the spirit that turned a war cry into a whistle. Look closely at the mask, for in this theater of the South, the mask is often more real than the face. This song gives us the happy subservient, a creature of myth who finds joy in the very dirt that clutched at his ankles during the Reconstruction. It is a masterclass in the magical Negro trope, where the sun is always shining on the man who asks for nothing. We use this song in our study not to sing along, but to deconstruct the lost cause narrative that paints our past in watercolors. It is a screen, a shimmering veil of relentless optimism designed to mask the jagged edges of economic ruin and the social ghosts that stalked the 1870s, making a paradise out of a prison. There are two Souths, my dear, and they dance a slow, agonizing waltz together in the stagnant light of the marshes. To understand the zippity sunshine, one must also hear the strange fruit hanging black and bitter from the poplar trees. If we pair this bouncy rhythm with the low, mournful call of Go Down Moses, we see the true map of our soul. One South is a romanticized pastoral dream where the bluebird is a friend. The other is a site of systemic trauma where the earth itself remembers the blood. We must hold both in our hands like a bird and a stone to understand why the song's cheerfulness feels like a hand over a mouth. Consider the man who sang it, James Baskett, whose voice had the richness of dark loam and the clarity of a mountain stream. He was the first black man to be given an Oscar, though they called it honorary, a gilded consolation prize for a man who could not even attend the premiere of his own film in a segregated theater. His legacy is a testament to the black artist's ability to bloom even in a parched field, finding a way to pour genius into a vessel that was built to diminish him. We look at him and see the tragedy of the lion forced to play the lamb, a performance so brilliant it almost makes us forget the bars of the cage. Yet there is a danger in the singing, a risk that we might erase the struggle with a catchy refrain. The core of the grievance is that the song insists everything is satisfactual for a black man in a world that was anything but. To use this song during a month meant for honoring the truth of black history can feel like a betrayal, a tone-deaf echo of a time when silence was the only safety. It leans too hard into the sanitized version of the past, a corporate product polished by Ali Rubel and Ray Gilbert, white man writing for a white-owned studio, offering a commercialized ghost of a culture rather than the heartbeat of the culture itself. For many of our kin, this melody is not a song at all, but a trigger, a sharp reminder of the Jim Crow caricatures that once lined the shelves and haunted the screens. Without a rigorous frame of study, its presence can feel like a validation of the happy sharecropper myth, a slap in the face to those who fought to break the very stereotypes the song reinforces. It is a caricature that Black History Month seeks to dismantle, stone by heavy stone, and we must be careful not to rebuild the wall while we are trying to tear it down.
There is so much true literature to consume, voices that rose from the soil without the permission of a studio executive. Why should we linger on a Disney tune when the words of Zora Neale Hurston are waiting like a feast? Why spend our breath on a corporate artifact when Alice Walker and Ernest Gaines have written the gospel of our survival? To focus too long on the satisfactual is to take space away from the authentic, to let the shadow of a mouse eclipse the brilliance of the Harlem Renaissance and the deep, true roots of Southern black authorship. So, if you must bring this song into the light, do not bring it as a celebration. Bring it as a specimen. Pin it to the board like a moth with colorful wings and a hollow body. It is an essential piece of our myth-making, a window into how the South has been imagined and misrepresented by those who preferred the lie to the truth. It is a tool for analysis, a way to see the cracks in the porcelain of our cultural history, but it is not the song of our people. If you seek the heart of the South, look past the bluebird and find the rabbit who is still running, still clever, and still free in the original briar patch.
The sun is dipping low now, casting long, spindly shadows across the marsh grass where the gullah spirits have whispered these stories since the mud was new. We must remember, as we let that chipper Disney melody dissolve into the humid air, that the tales of Uncle Remus didn't spring from the head of some white man with a printing press. They are the stolen echoes of the Low Country, ancient and rhythmic, birthed in the salt air and the struggle of those who walk these shores in chains. Perhaps in some distant season, when the light is more honest, the House of Mouse will find the courage to tell those stories as they were meant to be told, stripped of the syrup and the sunshine, restored to their rightful trickster glory. But for now, we leave the briar patch behind and turn our weary eyes toward a different kind of traveler on these dusty post-war roads.
When the smoke finally cleared from the charred remains of our grand chimneys and the silence of the surrender settled over the decimated fields, it wasn't just the carpetbaggers who arrived with the tide. There were others, quiet, plain-clothes souls with peace in their pockets and a steady, silent resolve in their hearts. The Quakers, those friends who had long stood against the peculiar institution of our shame, did not turn their backs on the wreckage of the South. Instead, they sent their missionaries into the ruins, not with a sword, but with a trowel and a primer. They walked into the heat of the Reconstruction, reaching out their hands to mend the tattered fabric of a society that had nearly bled itself dry, planting seeds of education and reconciliation in the very soil that had once been watered by the tears of the oppressed. It is a peculiar thing, darling, how the Spirit chooses to move when the world has been stripped to its very joists. After the great unpleasantness, when the porches of the South were sagging under the weight of ghosts and the fields were nothing but scarred red clay crying out for mercy, there came a people who did not carry the fire of vengeance, but the quiet light of the inner voice. They tell a story, and it is a story old as the roots of the water oak, of how the Friends, those Quakers from the North, looked upon our ruin not as a graveyard, but as a mission field. They saw the bones of the land and decided they must be made to dance again. When the smoke finally cleared from the charred remains of our grand chimneys and the silence of the surrender settled over the decimated fields, it wasn't just the carpetbaggers who arrived with the tide. There were others, quiet, plain-clothes souls with peace in their pockets and a steady, silent resolve in their hearts. The Quakers, those friends who had long stood against the peculiar institution of our shame, did not turn their backs on the wreckage of the South. Instead, they sent their missionaries into the ruins, not with a sword, but with a trowel and a primer. They walked into the heat of the Reconstruction, reaching out their hands to mend the tattered fabric of a society that had nearly bled itself dry, planting seeds of education and reconciliation in the very soil that had once been watered by the tears of the oppressed. It is a peculiar thing, darling, how the Spirit chooses to move when the world has been stripped to its very joists. After the great unpleasantness, when the porches of the South were sagging under the weight of ghosts and the fields were nothing but scarred red clay crying out for mercy, there came a people who did not carry the fire of vengeance, but the quiet light of the inner voice. They tell a story, and it is a story old as the roots of the water oak, of how the Friends, those Quakers from the North, looked upon our ruin not as a graveyard, but as a mission field. They saw the bones of the land and decided they must be made to dance again.
In the year 1865, when the ink on the surrender was barely dry and the silence was louder than any cannonade, the Baltimore Association rose up like a steady heartbeat. They were the engine, you see, a collective of souls who understood that a man cannot hear the word of God if his belly is folding in on itself. They did not come to preach from the high pulpits of the city. They came to the dirt. Near High Point, in that rolling North Carolina country, they planted a model farm. It was a cathedral of scientific toil. The earth was exhausted, bled white by years of cotton and tobacco that took everything and gave nothing back. But the Friends brought the gospel of crop rotation and the salvation of fertilizers. They taught the red clay to breathe once more, whispering to the farmers of clover and better livestock, providing the seeds and the credit that the broken banks would not dare to offer. Listen now, for this is how the rhythm of a people changes. They believed education was the great equalizer, a bridge built over the chasm of the past. Long before the government found its footing in the dust, the Quakers were building schoolhouses for the freedmen, those sons and daughters of a new morning. In Arkansas, they raised the Southland Institute, a beacon that offered higher learning when the rest of the world offered only a closed door. And in North Carolina, they took the New Garden Boarding School, a fragile thing, nearly flickering out, and breathed life into it until it became Guilford College. They taught the boys and the girls together, and they spoke of racial tolerance in a time when such words were considered a dangerous perfume. They were a quiet people, practicing a quietism that allowed them to walk where others were burned away. They occupied that narrow, shimmering middle ground, acting as a bridge between the bitter hearts of the ex-Confederates and the radical fires of the reformers. They did not shout, they petitioned. They walked the halls of legislatures, soft-souled and firm-willed, asking for the grace of public schools and the dignity of the prisoner. They were the architects of a social safety net that we still cling to today. It is said that the clover they brought stayed long after they departed. They taught the farmers to love the grass so well that they saved the dairy industry before the cows had even found their way to the pasture. They shifted the very soul of the New South, moving it away from the cruel plantation shadow toward a horizon of industry and progress. They were the ones who showed us that a society could be rebuilt without the lash, and that the most radical act one can perform is to plant a seed in a field everyone else has given up for dead.
Before we let ourselves be lured down the moss-draped path toward those grand, crumbling porches where the weavers of the lost cause sit in their tarnished finery, we must pause a moment. They would have you believe in a world of endless hooped skirts and white-pillared dreams, where the cotton fields bloomed without blood, and the servants wore smiles as fixed and hollow as a porcelain doll's. It is a sweet, suffocating perfume they spray over the stench of the pits, but before we tangle with those high-born spiders and their silver-tongued myths, we must first address a different sort of deception. We've had our fill of the heavy, aching truths for a spell, so let us reach into the dark and pull out a bit of pure, unadulterated fiction, or as we prefer to call it in this house of secrets, the blatant lie. In the dim shadows of a world cloaked in sorrow, where the cries of the oppressed echoed through the whispered winds, there lay a hidden path, the Underground Railroad. A treacherous journey, shrouded in secrecy, ventured forth from the hearts of brave souls yearning for freedom. It is said that between 25,000 and 100,000 enslaved hearts took the leap into the night, their spirits dancing on the edge of despair and hope. Among these valiant spirits, roughly 30,000 to 40,000 sought refuge in the embrace of Canada, each step a defiant declaration against the chains that bound them. The exact count of those who slipped away into the realm of liberation remains elusive, like threads of memory fading in the flickering light of remembrance. Yet the very essence of the Underground Railroad resonates, a testament to courage, resilience, and the undying pursuit of freedom, all woven into the tapestry of human spirit.
Beneath the heavy, gnarled branches of the cypress, where the air thickens with shadows and the whispers of lost souls drift through the night, I witnessed a vision that clung to me like the dampness of the swamp. The moon hung low, casting a silvery glow over a shanty nestled deep in the marsh, a sanctuary for weary hearts. They came seeking light, their hopes intertwined with the cycles of the earth and the spirits of their ancestors. The cypress stood tall, a nurturing figure in this wild expanse, guiding them through a sacred path laden with the weight of history. A crow swept down, its wings rustling like the leaves of prayer, bringing with it the ancient wisdom of those who had walked before. I felt the tremor of its call vibrating in my bones, urging the seekers forth toward the embrace of the shanty where freedom lay just beyond the fog. All around me, the night air hung heavy with the stories of those daring enough to chase the dawn, evading the iron shackles that clung to their past. As I gazed deeper into the scene, the silhouette of the alligator emerged from the depths, its scales shimmering like darkened jewels in the half-light. It glided silently through the murky waters, a watchful guardian of the journey that echoed across time. The seams of reality and spirit intertwined as the desperate travelers pushed onward, their feet stirring the muddy earth, carrying with them the hope birthed in the cypress's shade, a hope as resilient as the roots that anchored it to the island. I stood entranced, witnessing their quiet strength as they tread the hidden paths through the swamp, shoulder to shoulder, pursuit and perseverance woven into each determined step. Each figure was a luminous thread in the tapestry of freedom, laboring together to break free from the chains that sought to bind them. With the crow's call urging 'em on and the alligator guiding their way, they forged ahead into the night, reminders of what it meant to reclaim one's destiny and honor the struggles of those who came before. In this heart of the swamp, where the very essence of life pulses through the roots and branches, the ancestral spirits sang, weaving stories of resilience and courage through the stillness. I recognized the silhouette of the alligator gliding through the dark waters, its presence a testament to Delphine, a revered ancestor of the Beaumonts who had sacrificed so much to guide her kin. The crow perched nearby, its call echoing with the strength of Eleanor Margot Hather of Beaumont, who had aided countless enslaved neighbors in their desperate bids for freedom along the Underground Railroad. Both spirits, fierce and wise, personified the righteousness that towered above wickedness in this swamp. Yet, as the shadows lengthened, I sensed an unsettling presence. Wickedness had begun to rise again, casting a pall of uncertainty over the sacred ground. Still, the cypress stood resilient against the encroaching darkness, a symbol of the enduring fight for justice and the promise of what is right. In this moment, I felt the strength of my ancestors flowing through my veins, a reminder that as long as we honor their legacy, the spirit of Delphine and Eleanor would guide us through whatever trials lay ahead, illuminating the path towards freedom and righteousness in the heart of the swamp.
It is an absurd truth, one that hangs over this moss-choked land like the scent of swamp water in August, that the history so many cling to is nothing more than a blatant lie, polished until it shines with a false and hollow light. We have a heritage here that is deep and dark and magnificent, a sprawling tapestry woven from the ancient spirits of the indigenous, the rhythmic, aching pulse of the African, and the weary, iron-clad grit of the European. These roots are tangled together in the red clay, thirsty and real, yet they are ignored in favor of a pale, sickly ghost of a story. It is a myth designed for no other purpose than to soothe the weeping sores of lost privilege and the bitter, cold sting of evaporated wealth. This grand deception was not forged in the fires of battle, but rather stitched together in the quiet shade of sewing circles and whispered over the delicate clinking of afternoon tea. It is a shroud made of silk and spite, meant to hide the bones of what we truly are. You would think, after all the blood that has been spilt to wash away such fantasies, that we would know better than to let the moths back into the wardrobe. Yet here we are again, watching the same old shadows lengthen across the porch. It would be hard to believe, it would be a mercy to doubt it, but the loom is humming once more, and the same old lies are being spun into a new and dangerous garment right before our very eyes.
On this salt-bleached piazza, where the tide water recedes to reveal the bones of the marsh, one must look closely at the gentility we inherited. It is an artifice, a carefully constructed stage set, allegedly perfected by the strategic hands of organized women's groups, those so-called ladies of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Daughters of the American Revolution. They were not mere mourners. They were the supposed architects of a regional memory that sought to bury the truth beneath a layer of white lace and ironclad denial. They used their status to navigate a patriarchal world, supposedly preserving a culture that was in truth a sharp divergence from the national conscience. The UDC, emerging in 1894, became the primary vessel for the so-called Lost Cause, a pseudo-historical myth allegedly designed to vindicate a rebellion. While the veterans spoke of old wounds, these women looked to the minds of the unborn. They sought a supposed indoctrination of the rising generation, crafting a so-called correct history that portrayed the antebellum South as an allegedly idyllic civilization. In their narrative, the noble defense of supposedly sacred states' rights superseded the reality of human bondage, which they supposedly minimized or recast as a benevolent shadow. By 1908, their historian general had turned the schoolroom into a battlefield. Mildred Lewis Rutherford and her committee issued a so-called measuring rod to test textbooks, an alleged guide that functioned as a blacklist for any book deemed unfriendly to their cause. They supposedly cleansed the libraries of Northern truths. Through the children of the Confederacy, they raised a memorial army, using ritual and song to instill a supposedly biological claim to a patriotism rooted in secession. These children were supposedly forged into keepers of a narrative that recast a military defeat as a valiant struggle against so-called deceitful Yankees. Their work moved from the page to the stone, allegedly monumentalizing the Southern landscape. Between 1890 and 1920, they placed hundreds of silent sentinels in civic spaces, most pointedly in front of courthouses. While they were supposedly mere memorials, these statues were strategically positioned to reaffirm a system of white supremacy during the height of Jim Crow era, sending a chilling message about the nature of so-called Southern justice. They allegedly sanitized the great plantations as well, turning sites of forced labor into shrines of architecture, where the history of the enslaved was supposedly annihilated in favor of domestic trivia. Now, as the New South emerges from the long grass, the world these women built is fracturing. In an urban landscape where a so-called caste-based society can no longer breathe, the modern UDC finds itself in a desperate defensive posture. In 20 and 23, they filed so-called lawsuits to stop the removal of the Reconciliation Memorial at Arlington, allegedly clinging to a 1914 agreement. Their leader, Julie Hardaway, speaks of a spirit that is supposedly dishonored, claiming that removal is an erasure of so-called national healing. But the tide has turned. In 20 and 20, more than 160 of these bronze ghosts were removed, as a new generation rejects the supposedly dignified reconciliation that was built on a foundation of silence and myth.
We must urge you, with all the refined insistence of a Delta hostess who won't let you leave without a Tupperware of leftover ham, to come back and join our circle again. Yes, we are going to say it. It is an unwritten rule for these parts, a sacred liturgy whispered in the rustle of the cornfields and shouted from the spaces between the grand white columns of the manor porch. It is the heartbeat of our hospitality, and it remains unchanged by time or tragedy. Y'all come back, you hear?
In honor of the legendary Robert Selden Duvall, January 5th, 1931, February 15, 2026, we celebrate an Oscar-winning titan whose 7-decade career remains a cornerstone of American cinema.
Oh, there he is, Mr. Tate. He didn't tell you his name.
It was his haunting, nearly wordless debut as Arthur Boo Radley in To Kill a Mockingbird that first cast the long, flickering shadow that set S.M. Beaumont on a dark and grotesque path through the Gothic South in search of its absurd truths. Duvall's ability to find profound humanity within the enigmatic and the discarded leaves behind a legacy as enduring as the Southern myths he helped deconstruct.
Hey, Boo.
Miss Jean Louise, Mr. Arthur Radley. I believe he already knows you.